Okay, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 4 of Mind the Music, the show, or podcast rather, where I talk about various music related topics that can help out producers, especially electronic producers. Although sometimes these topics will be more personal, just talking about some of my experiences with my own music, which you can listen to if you enjoy listening to me waffle on about random stuff like that. So, first of all, I'd like to apologize for not really doing anything over the last week. I've kind of not really been as productive as I usually am, and the reason for that is because I have not had any Wi-Fi in the house. I literally haven't had Wi-Fi for almost 2 weeks, so I've had to divert my attention away from what I would normally do in terms of promotion and making music, because I actually do need the internet to be able to produce music because of the resources that I have to look for. I've just been kind of busy with other things like reading, kind of keeping track of my fitness, and just playing loads of other games that don't require Wi-Fi, which is I don't have a lot of them as it turns out. Plus, I've had to turn my attention to daytime TV, which has not been particularly fun. But now that the Wi-Fi is back, I've got a lot of catching up to do because I have lost a lot of stuff as of recently. I've lost about 100 monthly listeners on Spotify as a result of the lack of Wi-Fi, which was a bit disappointing, but I knew it was coming. Every now and then I was able to check what was going on because I was having to use some of my data, which I don't like having to do because I'm currently on pay as you go, which means I have to pay a set amount every day that I want to use data, and then if I go over the limit, then I have to pay loads of extra cash. So I don't want to have to do that. And then over the last week, I've been to one or two family-related events where I've been able to very briefly use their Wi-Fi just to keep track of things that have been going on. So I have seen that activity on my end has been really declining, and there was nothing I could do about it, which was a huge shame. So I've got a lot of catching up to do, as I said. I would really love it if you guys could help me promote my latest track, Destroy the Vibe. It's one of my favourite tracks because it's got such a great sound to it. But because I wasn't able to promote it and I wasn't there to watch the premiere as well, which was very, very dissatisfying, it meant that it kind of lost out on the promotion that I would normally give it. So you guys will be doing me a huge favour if you could just help me kind of get that video up and running by watching the video. I'm going to leave a link to it here in the top right corner of this video, and I've also leave a link to it in the description and to the Spotify as well. It would honestly mean so much to me if you guys can just check it out whenever you can, because I think you guys will really enjoy it. I've also been preparing to go back to uni. I'm going back to uni on Saturday, the 12th of September, and that's going to be my last year of uni. So I've got a number of different new modules to do, which is going to be exciting, but also obviously quite nerve-wracking, as it always is. I'm still part of the Music Production Society, but that's going to function a bit differently. A lot of stuff at uni is going to function very differently, because of the COVID restrictions. And right now, a lot of stuff that's happening is very ambiguous. I still haven't received my timetable yet, which is very annoying and it just kind of puts me on edge a little bit, because we all want to get things going again. Everybody wants stuff to return to normal. Of course, they won't return to normal for a long time. I think the new normal is going to take place very soon, if not already. Yeah, when I get back to uni, when I move into my new flat, and when we get the Wi-Fi problem sorted that we have, because we've actually got a separate Wi-Fi problem at the new flat when I move in because it's not working. When everything gets sorted out and everything gets all dusted down, I will continue making music as I always have. As I'm going to mention at the end of the podcast, I've got a few new tracks lined up that they're all kind of buffered, ready to be released, which I'm looking forward to. And as long as the Wi-Fi stays up, I'll be able to promote them the same way as I always have. And lastly, for this intro, I'm just going to thank everybody. Thank you so much, guys. We've just hit 200 subscribers on the channel. It feels like it's been a long time, like since we've hit any sort of milestone. The last time we hit a milestone, which was 100 subscribers, was during my first year of uni, so roughly more than a year ago, and that was the special that I did then was Rise Again. I don't know whether I'm going to release a 200 subscriber special track this year. I don't think that sort of milestone really entails it. But what I might do is I might do some kind of setup video. If you guys want to see that, just let me know. But yeah, that's going to do it for the introduction. So, if you couldn't already tell from the title of this podcast, I'm going to be talking about breakdowns. So, what is a breakdown? What do I mean when I say breakdown? Well, if you're not familiar with dance music, or even if you're familiar with dance music, a breakdown is basically a section in a track that allows it normally happens after the drop, but it can also happen after the introduction, and sometimes after the second drop as well. It's a section of a track that brings about a new kind of energy, usually a more relaxed atmosphere, but it can also be quite energetic. And it just brings a lot more creativity and variation to the table. You're going to hear me say those words a lot during this podcast because they are quite important when it comes to breakdowns. So obviously the best part of any EDM track is the drop. The drop is what makes an EDM track memorable. It's the main course of a track. It's the part of a track that everybody looks forward to and brings about the most energy, and it is just very, very exciting to listen to. But of course, tracks tend to have only 2 drops that are usually the same length. Sometimes they're 8 bars, sometimes they're 16 bars, sometimes they can be stretched to 24 or even 32 bars, as I've done in the past. And normally the second drop will be more variated than the first. But after the first drop, and usually after the intro as well, unless you're going straight into a build section to hype up the drop, there will be a breakdown. So I'm going to go over that again. So after the introduction of a track, sometimes after the intro, you'll just go straight into a build section, which will then lead into the drop. So that obviously, it just doesn't waste any time really. But sometimes after the introduction, in fact, most of the time after the introduction, there will be a breakdown section, usually with some vocals, and then there'll be a build, and then there'll be the drop, which is, as I said, the main part of the track. And then when the drop finishes, the energy of a track has to change, because the drop of a track can't last the entirety of the track, because it gets very boring after a while. It gets very repetitive, and as much as it is great to have that sort of energy, you can't keep that energy going in a track for too long, because people will get bored. They're expecting something different at this point. They're expecting the next part of the track, which is another thing to look forward to. So when the drop finishes, the breakdown begins, and the breakdown marks a new section of the track, which is very interesting because it's different, or at least it should feel different. It should bring some new elements to the table to keep the track interesting. So now that we know what a breakdown is and roughly whereabouts it can be in a track, I'm going to talk about some breakdowns that I've listened to in the past from one particular artist who I've spoken about a lot in the past as well, who definitely has some tracks where the breakdowns could be improved a little bit, and I'm going to play them in this podcast as well so you get a better example. Then I'm going to kind of divert your attention to some better examples of breakdowns and why those breakdowns are better. And then once I've talked about all that stuff and given some examples, I'm going to talk about how I would normally go about making my breakdowns. Okay, so most breakdowns will feature a huge variation in their sound, something that really differentiates them from the drop and makes it a lot more entertaining to listen to. But as I said, not all breakdowns do this. Sometimes people get kind of lazy and kind of they lose that motivation to make an interesting breakdown because they think they can just make it really quickly by just using elements from the drop and changing them up a little bit, adding a little, like a clap here and there, or a little bit of sub bass. And such an example is a track made by an artist who I know is going to watch this podcast and is going to be very disappointed to hear that he's actually the one I'm talking about whose track can be improved upon. And that track in particular is called Helicopter. Now, he's going to know Helicopter was a good track, right? Helicopter, the drop was good, the sub bass was mixed really nicely, and the kick was great. There's one or two things in the track that can be improved, but the thing I'm going to be focusing on specifically is the breakdown. And the reason why is because the breakdown in Helicopter could definitely have been a lot better, as you're going to hear in a couple of minutes. So the reason why I didn't particularly like the breakdown of Helicopter was because it didn't bring anything new or particularly interesting to the table. After the main drop of Helicopter, when the breakdown begins, there's a nice little bit of white noise to kind of bring you into the breakdown, which I like to call the breath, because it allows you to take a bit of a breather so you can relax into the drop. But the actual breakdown section itself was very, very repetitive because it used the same elements as the drop, and there wasn't really much else to it. There was a little bit of sub bass. There was a clap that was added in the second half of the breakdown, but other than that, and other than a little bit of a filter change on the breakdown, on the main melody on the breakdown, sorry, there wasn't really a lot of variation to the breakdown. There was a lot missing. The texture is very thin, and it just felt like it could have used a lot more elements. So I'm going to play what that sounds like now. So what you're going to hear is the first drop going into the breakdown, and you can see for yourself. So as you can see, there wasn't a huge amount of variation in terms of the breakdown. Now I'm going to compare that rather narcissistically to one of my tracks called Beholder. Now that's one of my favourite tracks that I did at the time. I really enjoyed doing the drop, but I specifically really enjoyed doing the breakdown. It's one of my most underrated breakdowns of all time, and whenever I listen to it, it really makes me feel like I'm putting my hands in the air, and just I feel like there's an atmosphere in that track. I feel the atmosphere and the energy in my ears, even during the breakdown when it should feel more relaxed. There's so much going on. It's a big room track. It's a dance track that's designed to fill your ears with all kinds of different atmospheric elements, and that's exactly, for me, what Beholder does. But the reason why I say Beholder specifically and not any other of my tracks is because the main melody of Beholder is reused from the drop in the breakdown, the same way that in Helicopter the breakdown used the drop melody, right? So why am I kind of bringing that up? Well, it's because I added so many different sounds to the breakdown in Beholder. Even though I used the same melody as the drop, I was able to variate it in such a way that it was far more interesting to listen to, because the sound design was different. There was loads of stuff added, loads of effects and elements like noise, claps. The synths were really thick. They filled the room. They created a really interesting atmosphere, as you are about to hear. So hopefully you can hear from that the general tone was a bit different from Helicopter. Even though the melody was still reused from the drop part, there was just so much more going on, and that's one of the reasons why I really enjoy listening to the breakdown of Helicopter. Now, of course, it would be pretty stupid of me to say that his track was bad and then my track was good and to just move on from there. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one of my tracks which had a bad breakdown, and then I'm going to explain why. Then I'm going to show you one of his tracks which has a good breakdown, then I'm going to explain why. So one of my tracks that had a bad breakdown, and that for me, the track in all the tracks that I've ever done, one of the most recent tracks that I've done which had a particularly poor breakdown was Surge, which was part of the Upgrades EP. I think it's the track 5 in the Upgrades EP, which I will also leave a link to in the top right corner and the description. The reason why Surge's breakdown was a bit crap was just because there wasn't really much interesting going on, and it was also way too short. Also, when it comes to breakdown, it wasn't really much of a breakdown. It was more like a build section, really, but I guess you could label part of it as a breakdown, because the two aren't necessarily distinct. So, yeah, the reason why the breakdown in Surge was quite boring was because all I did after the introduction sections in the first drop, I just added an arpeggiator, which just basically replayed the root note over and over again, which was an F. And then I added some vocal chops, the same vocal chops that I used in the drop parts, just added a little bit of a filter. I added like a ride cymbal, and that was pretty much all there was to it. It was very short and it was very, very simple. So you can see from that how basic it was and how much I could have potentially done with that track. I was very kind of relaxed with that track. I didn't really do as much as I should have done, and I will admit that track was rushed a little bit. But now I'm going to compare that track with another one of Black Winter's tracks called Hold On, which had a very good breakdown, and as you're about to see. You can see from that breakdown that it was a lot more variated and just kind of brought a lot more to the table, a lot more energy, a lot more atmosphere to your ears. It was just a lot more interesting to listen to. Now I'm going to show you some examples of other breakdowns which I particularly enjoyed that you might also be able to get inspiration from, but these are from artists which are a lot bigger than us. Now the first guy I'm going to show you is someone that I've mentioned in the past who is a big inspiration for me, an artist called Nom de Strip, who has made a number of amazing tracks, and the track I'm about to show you is probably one of my favourite tracks of all time. Because of just how much energy it brings and because of how well mixed it is. But I'm going to specifically show you the breakdown because he reuses the main synth lead that he used in the drop. He reuses that in the breakdown. It's sort of like an acidy alien sound, hence why it's called Aliens. But he also introduces a number of different chord ideas into the breakdown as well, which makes it really interesting to listen to. The next breakdown I'm going to introduce to you is from an artist or pair of artists called Knife Party, who were originally the artists Pendulum, but they then later became Knife Party. They've released a number of EPs. They've released an album called Abandoned Ship, very good album. Would highly recommend checking it out if you are an EDM producer like me. And the track I'm going to show you is called Tourniquet. I've probably not pronounced that correctly, but it has a very, very enjoyable breakdown with some really thick chords, and it's just mixed so well. It brings something really interesting to the track. Okay, the last artist I'm going to show you is once again Knife Party, but this time I'm going to show you one of their tracks called Rage Valley from the EP Rage Valley. Yep, it's one of those EPs where they've literally used the same name as one of their tracks, so you know that while you're listening to the EP, as soon as you get to that track, oh, it's going to be super hyped up, and it is. It's a very, very hyped up track. And the breakdown of this track is probably one of my favorite breakdowns of any track I've ever listened to, because it has such an insane amount of atmospheric energy, and it just brings so much stuff to the table. When you're listening to this and you kind of shut your eyes and you imagine yourself there at like a festival with all these people clapping, like all the synths that are playing, it is astonishing how they've managed to mix that. So here's that. Okay, so now that you've heard some examples of some decent breakdowns, in my opinion, now I'm going to talk to you guys about something that is probably more relevant to producers. It's how do I actually go about making my breakdowns? Because this is obviously an important question, because sometimes people really get stuck on breakdowns and they need ideas on how to push themselves forwards and out of these creative barriers that they can often find themselves in. I'm also someone that tends to find myself in these, they're called creative barriers or creativity barriers, where you basically get stuck on a track, and if you don't know how to develop it, you give up, and it ends up becoming a scrapped project, of which I have quite a few, as you can see from the scrapped projects videos that are on my channel. Now, as with all of my music, the way I go about doing this sort of thing is different for each track, but one thing is very similar, right? The thing that's similar is I always work on the breakdown at the same time. So what I mean by that is whenever I start a track, I'll always start off working on the drop. If I have a solid drop, then I know I can continue with the track. So the drop's the first thing I work on. Then once I've done the drop, I will move all the elements of the drop forward a bit so I can work on a build section, so I know exactly how the drop is going to be led into. And once I have those two things sorted out, I then start to work on the breakdown, something that adds something completely new and different and creative. And I'd like to say original, but it's not always original, because people always say EDM's a bit of a copycat genre, which is a bit irritating to hear. It is partially true. But then my response to that is most genres are copycat genres, because for you to make your own music, you have to base it off of something else. But I'll come to that later on, maybe in another podcast episode. But basically, once I have the ideas that I want for the drop finished and the build sort of done, I might come up with something for the introduction and the outro later. They are what I do last. I work on the intro and the outro last. Once I've got the drop and the build nailed down, I can then work from the end of the drop and start working on a breakdown. But the question is, how do I actually start that breakdown? Because the breakdown always starts off as a completely blank slate. So what's the first thing I do? Well, as I said, it varies. Sometimes I will just experiment with sounds that I have that I've used with the drop. I'll just mess about with some melodic ideas using the drop synths. But more often what I'll do is I will use new synths that I haven't used yet, so I can bring something new to the table. But I would experiment with ideas that I used in the drop, try to variate them a little bit. Sometimes I would do something completely different, and this is mostly the case for my tracks. I will just use like an arpeggiated chord pattern. Sometimes it will go up, sometimes it will go down, sometimes it will go up and down, which is a lot of fun to play around with. More often than not, I'll use things like plucks in the drop, something that's really atmospheric and really like makes you want to throw your hands in the air, but like, oh, this brings so much like cool energy to the table. Something that I haven't already used, because then otherwise it would be noticeable and then it would therefore be repetitive and boring. I don't normally use percussive elements in the drop until after I've finished messing around with a drop related idea. So I'll experiment with different melodic ideas on my MIDI keyboard that I have next to me. And if you don't have a MIDI keyboard, I would highly recommend getting one, because even though you might think using a virtual keyboard on your program is enough, trust me, if you don't have a MIDI keyboard, you'll find it much harder to come up with these sorts of ideas early on. Sometimes I'll have ideas like already ready for me to use. Like in my head, I would have finished a job and I already know exactly what I want to do for the breakdown. But more often than not, that doesn't really happen. So sometimes I'll start off messing around with melodic ideas. But before I do that, usually what I'll do is I will mess around with some chords, because good breakdowns, have some thick chords that you can then work from afterwards. So as long as you've got a decent chord pattern for your breakdown, you can then work on something else. Sometimes I'll add vocals to my breakdowns. Sometimes there'll be normal lyrics, but sometimes they'll just be nonsense lyrics, which is basically, they're not words. They sound like I'm saying words, but it's like a choir just sort of saying like Latin words that you can't really understand, but they're sort of there and they do sound really good in the breakdown. And that is actually something that I've used in an upcoming track, which is coming in a few weeks' time. So yeah, that'll be interesting. Sometimes I'll just go into my library of more than 20,000 samples that I've got and just kind of see if I can find a chord pattern or some kind of electronic sample that I can use. But more often than not, I'll come across as I said, a creative barrier where I'm stuck looking for new ideas, and I'll just sort of divert my attention to the internet and see if I can find ideas by listening to tracks from my favorite artists. So for example, I'll listen to Nom de Strip, I'll listen to Martin Garrix, I'll listen to Knife Party or Kashmir or Monster Cat or MDK, Diplo, Tiesto, all sorts of different artists to give me that kind of inspiration that I'm looking for. Because if you don't have that inspiration, if you don't have ideas from other people, you can't make something new and you can't add anything interesting to your tracks. All of your ideas as a producer come from other people. It comes from stuff that you've heard in the past, stuff that you've been able to mess around with in the past because of what you've listened to. And that's true for all of my tracks. You use chords that you've heard before. You use notes and chords that seem like they work well together, but you only know that they work well together because you heard them working well somewhere else. You've had the chance to experiment with them. But yeah, so I'd always recommend starting off a breakdown by looking at some chord ideas and worrying about the sound design later. Get the chords nailed down, then try and work on a chord-related sound design, something that's quite thick in the track. Don't worry about bass, just work on chords, because the bass is really easy to do. You could basically just use, the root note that you're working with, and that's it, you're sorted. But start with some chordal ideas, and then once you've got some chords nailed down, start working on some melodic ideas. Like I would recommend some arpeggiators, which is basically like a broken chord pattern that moves up or down or both. And then once you've got those sorts of things sorted out, you can experiment with a lot of different things to bring out the atmosphere in your track. You can add strings, you can add a choir, that's what I tend to do. You can add some vocal chops with lots of reverb. You can also add some percussive elements if you want a bigger, more energetic sound, like for example claps. You could add rides, you could add just an acoustic drum kit like I did in the second half of Ultra Core, which in my opinion was quite a good idea. But you'd also want to add some elements like white noise, some sidechain noise, some sort of sweeps and swooshes and effects to bring out the most energy and variation you can, because that's what people are looking for. They're looking for those little details in a track, not necessarily being the best mixed. It doesn't matter. They're looking for that creativity in a track, and you can provide that creativity by just messing around with as many different ideas as you want and making sure that it's not too messy, making sure everything works and everything sits nicely in a track, but making sure that it's not too much, right? Add some noise, add a crowd effect. I always tend to add a sort of like screaming crowd effect very gently in my track, just for that extra level of texture, because it is quite noisy. And yeah, that's pretty much how I go about sorting out the breakdown. It does take a lot of experimenting, it does take a lot of messing around, but as I've said before, messing around is a huge part of making a new track. It's a huge part of discovering what you want in a track and what's good. You can't immediately come up with a good idea. It has to come, well, I guess people do say that genius happens in the moment, and that is true. When I did Ghost God, I was working on a level where I just did it in a day because I knew exactly what I wanted. But sometimes if you're not in that state of mind, you need more time to think about what it is that you actually want to add in the track. So you need to mess around with the synths that you've got, loads of different ideas, look online, look for inspiration, look for sounds that you particularly like. And if you like them, then you know you can use them in a track. So yeah, that's pretty much all I can say when it comes to working on a breakdown. As I said, loads of different things, but you can go ahead and experiment with all these different ideas and see if they work out for you. That's going to wrap it up for this podcast, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it. It was very waffly, and I mean, that is kind of the concept of these podcasts. It's just me talking about stuff that might be useful whilst you do something else in the background. So we're going to end this here. As I said at the beginning of the podcast, I've got 2 new EDM tracks coming out very soon, but before they do, I've got one hip-hop track coming out before that, which is going to be really good. I'm going to do like a 4 or 5 day premiere before that comes out. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy it when it does come out, but that's going to end this podcast here. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will see you soon. Bye.